Right. So it is now being recorded. Let me share the screen. It's a very short file. I have uploaded that a few minutes ago to the D12 site. I think I have a slightly more elaborate version of the test. This is just a sample of how to use asserts for testing a little bit of a tiny part of the library system, but you can kind of expand this. So what does this do? Well, this does testing without you're having to type in anything. So what is the advantage? The advantage is you can run this test and it will tell you whether the test passed or not. You don't have to look at the output and then compare whether you got a certain display or whether a certain condition was satisfied. None of that. If it goes through, that's it. If it has problems, it will just crash. So it takes the TDM out of testing considerably. You have to create the test once, and then you can just run it again and again as you make changes. You just run this, and if it runs okay, that's it. You're done. You know, it is a lot easier. So what does this do? You can see the class automated tester, and it keeps a reference to the library. So when you create this, you need to pass the library object, and then it calls test. So this is, as I said, a very small part of testing, but you can keep on doing these kinds of things for testing a substantial part of the application. Let me try to explain what is going on here in this method, because that is where the testing occurs. So for every member, there is a name, address, and a phone number. So I'm planning to create, in this test, 3 members. So I'm storing the names N1, N2, and N3. When you test, you don't have to worry about long names or anything, because all you need are some strings for the names, addresses, and phone numbers. You don't have to type in numbers that look like real data or addresses that correspond to something that you find in real life. None of that. So I'm having names like N1, N2, and N3. Addresses are A1, A2, and A3. The phone numbers are P1, P2, and P3. So I create 3 arrays. I can create more if I wanted by typing in more entries over here. Since I have an array of 3 for names, length 3, I mean, addresses also have the same length. So does this array, phones. So there are 3 entries in each of these arrays. So there are 3 names, 3 addresses, and 3 phones. And I create an array of members of size 3. The idea is that the first member will have the name N1, address A1, and phone P1. The second member has these 3 values for names, addresses, and phones, N2, A2, and P2. And similarly, the third member is N3, A3, and P3. That is my plan. So when I start, I mean, this is really not needed. It doesn't really matter. This could go. I go into a loop that is dependent on the length of one of these arrays. I wrote names.length. It could have been addresses.length and phones.length, or I could have had a constant. You can make it as sophisticated as you want, but make sure that you have as many names as addresses and as phone numbers. At least in this, I have to have it that way. You might be able to make it even more sophisticated so that you can reuse some of these names. But I didn't want to make this too complicated, because then I will lose the advantage of automated testing. I mean, if the test file itself is too complicated, I need to make sure that my test process doesn't have bugs, So I didn't want to make this any more complicated than it needs to be. And I would advise that to you too, because if your test is not clear, you're not sure whether you are testing it properly. And this is using the old version of the test data, so it doesn't create the result object. So really, request object. So I really should be having, I will update this. I forgot about that part. I should be creating a request object, request.instance. I don't have that, so it is going to give me an error. But of course, this is not part of any project. This is an isolated Java file. So I need to store the name, address, and phone number of the first member into a request object. Okay. And then I will call add member of library with that request object. I overlooked the fact that we are using the request object, so I need to update this. I will update it sometime tomorrow and upload it. Okay, now I have created ignore these 3 lines for the moment. Okay. For about 30 seconds or so, ignore these 3 lines. I am going to create 3 members because names.length is 3, and I am storing each member into this array. After that, after storing each member, I am calling the getName method on members. Of course, you will not be able to do this in the current library system because it does not expose any references to these entities. So you won't be able to do this, but I will adjust the tester sometime tomorrow and upload that. Okay. But the idea is not different. You look at the member's name. At this count, the member's name has to be equal to the name at that location. So if the first member should have the name N1, I'm checking that here. Members count.getName. What is the name of the member at this index? Is it equal to the names at this same index? If so, this will return true. And I am putting an assert in front of it, which essentially checks whether the condition is true or not. If the condition is true, the assert passes. It doesn't cause any trouble. But if this condition is not true, if it is false, assert will crash here, and that is the end of your program. And you will get an error saying assertion error at line 38 or something like that. So I will get an error here. Similarly, I check for the address and phone number. That's it. So you can, your test data has been created and your testing process is embedded within these assert statements. So all you need to do is run this program. If it survives without any crash, these tests worked out. Okay, you can do more elaborate tests using other methods, other facade methods, and so on and so forth. But this is the basic idea. But to execute this, if you want to run this, if you want, let me backtrack a little bit. Assertions are normally disabled. That is, when Java runs, it ignores all asserts. So if you run this without doing anything special, these assertions will all be ignored and your program will behave as if it has no errors. So that is not going to be very useful. It will not perform any of these tests and check whether the results are okay. So you have to explicitly ask Java to enable assertions. For that, what you need to do is in Eclipse, you go to the run configuration, and in the VM arguments, type in negative EA minus, that is an option, EA for enable assertions. So in the run configurations, you have used this run configuration when you ran JavaFX. So there is a VM arguments, if you recall, where you had a module path and all that stuff, right? VM arguments, you just type in negative EA minus EA, which means enable assertions. EA for enable assertions. And when you are satisfied with your tests, you can simply take away this option and it will ignore all the assertions. You don't have to remove them from your tests. I mean, you don't have to remove the assertions physically, just have this minus EA in your program, in your VM arguments. That is essentially what assertions do. Any questions? I will post a more refined version of this that conforms to the library system so that it passes the request object and uses the result object and so on and so forth. The automated tester might be on the business side, not on the user interface side, but it doesn't really matter. I will make the necessary adjustments, okay? Any questions? Okay, that's what I essentially had in mind for talking to you tonight. If you don't have any more questions, I'm going to stop recording and we can start the class exercise. Today's class exercise has about 35, 37 questions, and most of it, not every question, most of it is related to the implementation. So you need to go to, let me show you here. Let me share the screen. Can't find it. It may be this, yeah, right. Yeah, if you go to the D2L site and click on class project implementations, you will find 3 files. You can ignore the automated tester. I will update this file tomorrow with a more interesting version that is great, that uses the request and result objects, or at least, okay, at least it is conforming to the current implementation of the library. Here is my implementation of the library system. This is the business project or the business module, and this is the user interface module. So what I would like you to do is download these 2 things, and you need to open these projects. Some of the questions in the class exercise ask you to look at specific line numbers. I hope the line numbers are all correct. I haven't, I checked those things yesterday. I hope they are, that I haven't made any mistakes. If you notice any inconsistencies, let me know. So some of them will ask, what happens in this particular line number kind of questions, you know, so you need to go through the code to some extent. So the purpose of the class exercise tonight is to help you navigate the code. Okay. as we saw last week, we saw the structure of the code last week, at least in the you saw that in the videos, right? It has all these different packages, like entities, facade, and iterators, collections, and so on. So it is the same project. It's the same file. Any questions before we close this? Anybody? All right. Then I'm going to stop the recording. I'm